Alone in the tail of AB-17, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth stared down a sky filled with German fighters. At 25,000 feet, with minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit biting through his heated suit, every second was a fight for survival. The manuals said wait, conserve ammo, but waiting meant death. Tracers streaked past as enemy fighters closed in. With only a few hundred rounds left and a crippled bomber behind him, Aruth had to act, and fast. Every shot could save his crew or doom them. What he did next would defy all Air Force rules and turn the tide of bomber warfare. At 6:15 a.m. on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth climbed into the tail of the B-17 bomber Tanlio at RAF Kimbolton, the pale gray light of an English dawn stretching before him. He was 24, seasoned with 12 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills, but nothing could have fully prepared him for what lay ahead. Over 300 Luftwaffe fighters awaiting along the route deep into Germany. The cramped tail compartment, just 4 feet wide and 5 feet long, felt even smaller as Aruth settled onto the thin bicycle seat workstation. 2 Browning M250 machine guns bristled behind the plexiglass, his only defense in the freezing stratosphere above. At 25,000 feet, temperatures plunged to nearly minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and his electrically heated flight suit was the fragile barrier between him and a deadly, icy end. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner sat alone, isolated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of cold aluminum, facing the sky and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. No one could speak to him. No one could help if disaster struck. Just him, 2 guns, and the merciless air above enemy territory. The numbers were grim. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived just 11 missions before being shot down, captured, or killed. Tail gunners were the first to face the storm and the deadliest. German pilots preferred the rear, and the tail bore the brunt of the assault. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 bombers in only 2 months, 90 men gone. The danger came down to geometry. German pilots knew that attacking from behind gave them the longest firing window, and they exploited it ruthlessly. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 diving in from the 6 o'clock position at 350 miles per hour had nearly 10 seconds to line up a deadly shot. The tail gunner had the same 10 seconds to hit a target hurtling forward at almost 600 miles per hour combined speed. Most never managed it. The Focke-Wulf 190 was even deadlier, armed with 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single well-aimed burst could smash the plexiglass, kill the gunner instantly, and wreck the tail controls. Without a protective tail, a bomber was a sitting target. The fighters would circle, line up again, and finish the attack. Army Air Force gunnery manuals drilled one rule into every tail gunner. Wait, conserve ammunition, and only fire at targets within 300 yards. In theory, it made perfect sense. In the chaos of combat, though, 300 yards often meant it was already too late. The enemy was shooting first. Aruth had seen it happen. On his 6th mission, a B-17 flying just off Tandelo's right wing took a devastating hit to the tail. The gunner never had a chance to fire. The fighter swooped in, guns blazing, and rounds tore through the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber spiraled out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes deployed, but the tail gunner was not among them. The manuals demanded patience. Aruth began to question everything he had been taught. The German fighters attacked from long range, fully aware that American gunners were trained to hold their fire. They had studied the patterns, turning the Army Air Force manuals into a deadly roadmap. On that morning, 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England. A squadron of 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them for part of the journey, but fuel limitations meant the fighters would peel off over Belgium, leaving the bombers to face the final 200 miles to their target alone. Aruth methodically checked his ammunition, 400 rounds per gun, 800 in total. According to the manual, it was enough for a standard mission. But Aruth had already decided the doctrine was flawed, and by noon, he would find out just how right he was. The stakes of a miscalculation were deadly: a closed casket and a telegram to the family waiting at home. The formation climbed steadily over the English Channel, reaching 14,000 feet. Through his blood-spattered plexiglass window, Aruth watched the water shrink below and the white cliffs of Dover fade into a thin, distant line. Ahead stretched occupied France, Belgium, and deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts kept pace around the bomber stream, offering a fragile sense of security. But Aruth knew the math all too well. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for barely 90 minutes of combat, while the mission to the castle would take 6 hours. Beyond the escorts, the bombers would be on their own. Aruth had flown his first missions by the book, waiting for the fighter to come close before firing. Aim carefully. Fire in controlled bursts. Conserve every round. That's what gunnery instructors drilled into every tail gunner at training school. Ammunition was precious, and precision mattered far more than volume. A well-disciplined gunner could stretch 800 rounds across an entire mission, but only if the enemy behaved as expected. The Luftwaffe had other plans. German pilots had studied American tactics in detail. They knew gunners waited until the enemy was within 300 yards to fire, so they struck from 600 yards, raining cannon shells into bomber formations before any shots could be returned. By the time American gunners reacted, the damage was often already catastrophic. Aruth saw the problem differently. A Focke-Wulf 190 closing from 600 yards wasn't a tiny, fleeting target. It was flying straight toward him, nose first, presenting the largest profile possible. At that speed, its apparent size doubled with every passing second, giving him a window he was ready to exploit. A tail gunner who opened fire early could guide his tracers straight onto the incoming enemy, refining his aim as the distance closed. The danger, of course, was running out of ammunition. 800 rounds seemed like plenty, until you divided them among the dozens of fighters that might attack in a single mission. Some sorties saw 15, 20, or even 30 separate strikes. At 50 rounds per burst, the math was unforgiving. Yet Aruth understood the stakes. A gunner who hoarded ammo but was killed on the third wave had made a terrible bargain. True survival meant stopping the enemy before they could strike, even if it meant burning through bullets faster than recommended. There was no use in saving ammo if you were already dead. His first real test of this approach came during his fourth mission, a daring raid on submarine pens at St. Nazaire in June. 2 Bf-109s closed in from the classic 6 o'clock low position, the textbook angle for a tail attack. Standard Army Air Force doctrine would have told Aruth to hold fire and wait. But he acted differently. At 700 yards, he unleashed a burst from his guns. Tracers arced through the gray morning sky, initially falling short, then climbing perfectly toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the incoming fire and abruptly broke off, diving away before he could bring his cannons to bear. His wingmen followed suit. Neither aircraft scored a single hit on Tanlio. After landing, the crew chief checked the ammo. Nearly 200 rounds had been spent in just one engagement, a huge expenditure. At that rate, Aruth risked running dry long before reaching deeper into Germany, yet his bold decision had just saved the bomber. Aruth calmly explained his tactics, but the crew chief remained unconvinced. Word of his bold decision spread quickly among other tail gunners. Some called it reckless. Firing at long range went against every principle taught in the Army Air Force manuals. According to standard doctrine, conserving ammunition was the key to survival. Yet, Aruth's approach was a calculated gamble with his crew's lives. And it worked. Mission after mission, Tanlio returned safely to Kimbolton, while other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers had been lost, claiming 30 men. On July 30th, as the formation crossed into Belgium, Aruth watched the P-47 Thunderbolt escorts wave and turn back toward England. Fuel limits forced them to retreat, leaving the bombers to continue alone. Ahead, somewhere over enemy territory, nearly 300 German fighters waited. Every round in Aruth's guns would be needed to survive the coming onslaught. Aruth had to survive long enough to make every shot count. At 11:42, the first waves of enemy fighters appeared, climbing from the southeast in tight groups of 4. He counted 8, then 12, and finally lost track. The sky behind Tanlio was black with German aircraft, their yellow-nosed crosses cutting through the clouds. The lead fighter dived from the high 6 o'clock position at an astonishing 400 miles per hour, aiming straight for the bomber formation. Aruth followed it through his gun's sight, watching its wings grow larger with every heartbeat. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings erupted, tracer fire streaking across the sky, but the first rounds fell short, vanishing into empty air beneath the diving enemy. Aruth adjusted his aim, carefully walking the tracers upward. At 600 yards, his fire finally connected. Bright sparks erupted along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling, forcing the German pilot into a sharp right turn with smoke trailing from the aircraft. The fighter never completed its attack run, spiraling downward and vanishing into the clouds below. There was no time to celebrate. Another enemy plane was closing in, this one flying low, trying to slip beneath his guns. The angle was nearly impossible, forcing Aruth to depress his weapons to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long, controlled burst at the advancing fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot faltered, pulling up too soon and unleashing his cannon fire into the empty sky above Tandalo. The assault didn't let up. Waves of German fighters struck relentlessly for 47 minutes, slicing through the bomber formation and targeting any stragglers or damaged planes. Aruth fired at every threat that came within range, expending ammunition at 3 times the standard rate. His gun barrels glowed red-hot from continuous fire. At 12:29, a lone Bf-109 closed in from directly behind, flying straight and level. The pilot was either recklessly brave or gravely mistaken. Aruth locked the aircraft in his sights and held down both triggers. The twin Brownings thundered for 6 straight seconds, sending over 100 rounds into the incoming fighter. The Messerschmitt shattered, breaking apart in midair. The Messerschmitt's engines tore free from the fuselage, and its wings folded back as the remnants tumbled past Tandalo. Aruth caught sight of the empty cockpit. Whether the pilot had ejected or perished at the controls remained unknown. 2 confirmed kills, and his ammunition now down to just 180 rounds. At 12:51, the formation reached Castle and commenced its bombing run. For 11 tense minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to evade as they lined up their targets. The Luftwaffe recognized this as the moment of greatest vulnerability. Attacks intensified. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove from the 5 o'clock position toward Tandalo. Aruth swung his guns into position and fired a precise burst, striking the fighter's wing. The enemy pilot pressed the attack, cannon shells ripping through Tandalo's tail section. Aruth felt the impact before the pain hit. Fragments of 20mm shells tore through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and embedding themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed, and hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cramped compartment. Bleeding and operating one-handed, Aruth kept firing with his right gun, tracking the wounded Focke-Wulf as it limped away. A final, precise burst struck the fighter's tail, sending it snapping, rolling, and diving toward the ground. His 3rd kill of the mission. Voices crackled over the intercom. Crew members reported damage, flak ahead, and other threats, but Aruth could barely respond. His throat was dry, blood pooling and freezing on the compartment floor in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds fired, 63 remaining, and 3 enemy aircraft down, and the mission was only halfway complete. Tanlio still had 250 miles to cover back to England, flying through the same deadly corridor of enemy fighters that had nearly destroyed it on the inbound mission. Aruth wrapped a scarf tightly around his wounded arm, bracing for the next wave of attackers. At 1:04 p.m., the return flight commenced. Tanlio turned westward alongside 185 other bombers, leaving Castle behind in flames, black smoke rising into the sky. Aruth stayed locked in his position, eyes scanning through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe was far from finished. Over Belgium, German fighters regrouped, strategically positioning themselves along the bomber stream's route to the English Channel. Reinforcements replaced the planes lost or damaged earlier, setting the stage for a second gauntlet, just as lethal as the F. By now, Ruth's left arm had gone numb from both the cold and his injuries. His left gun was completely jammed, the feed mechanism destroyed by the same cannon shell that had wounded him. With only one functioning weapon and a mere 63 rounds to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace, every shot had to count. Calculations left no room for error. At this rate, he could engage maybe 3 enemy aircraft with 20 rounds each. The luxury of suppressive fire was gone. At 1:31 p.m., a pair of Bf-109s approached from the 7 o'clock position. Aruth waited until the closest fighter reached 500 yards, then unleashed a precise 12-round burst. His tracers struck true, slamming into the engine cowling and sending the German fighter into a defensive maneuver. The Messerschmitt flipped inverted and spiraled downward, leaving a trail of glycol coolant. Its wingmen broke off, choosing not to press the attack. With 51 rounds still in his belt, Tanlio continued its flight, crossing into France by 2:15 p.m. As the Luftwaffe fighters reached the edge of their operational range, the attacks gradually eased. By 2:47 p.m., the bomber formation had outrun the last of the German interceptors, and the white cliffs of the English Channel appeared on the horizon. The landing at RAF Kimmelton was completed at 3:52 p.m. Ruth could not climb from his tail position without help. The ground crew carefully extracted him through the narrow hatch and placed him on a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon cataloged 11 separate fragment wounds across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. News of his heroics spread quickly through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within hours, news spread that the tail gunner aboard Tanlio had achieved 3 confirmed kills and 2 probable strikes, all while wounded and operating a single functioning gun with only 63 rounds of ammunition. The mission's intelligence report highlighted his decision to engage early as a key factor in the bomber's survival. Curiosity and admiration spread quickly among other tail gunners. Standard Air Force doctrine instructed, wait until 300 yards, and emphasized strict ammunition conservation. Aruth, however, had opened fire at 800 yards, expending over 700 rounds before sustaining injuries. The conventional approach had cost many gunners their lives, but Aruth had survived. The gunnery officer of the 527th Squadron carefully reviewed the combat footage from Tanlio's mission, recognizing that Aruth's bold tactics had disrupted enemy attack patterns and changed the game for bomber defense. Gun camera footage revealed Aruth's tracers extending well beyond the standard engagement range, breaking up enemy attack runs before German pilots could establish precise firing solutions. His decision to open fire early forced the attackers to adjust their maneuvers, reducing accuracy and limiting damage to the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had started applying variations of Aruth's method. Their survival rates noticeably improved, and the bombers under their protection returned with significantly less damage. The pattern was clear and hard to ignore. On September 1st, the 379th Bombardment Group commander received a preliminary report. The findings suggested that aggressive, early engagement could dramatically reduce bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated Luftwaffe attacks. The implications challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Aruth was recovering at the station hospital, his wounds fortunately sparing major blood vessels and nerves. 3 weeks after the Castle mission, on August 19th, Aruth was cleared for duty by the flight surgeon. A replacement B-17 awaited him, as Tanlio had been retired due to the extensive battle damage it had suffered. The new aircraft carried the same name and welcomed back the same experienced crew. On August 26th, Aruth returned to his position in the tail, ready for the next mission. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe intelligence had begun noticing unusual changes in American bomber behavior. By early September, their officers recognized a clear pattern. Tail gunners were engaging enemy fighters much earlier than before, often at ranges exceeding 600 yards. This early fire disrupted attack formations that had previously proven reliable, forcing the Luftwaffe to rethink its tactics. German fighter pilots began reporting the changes across debriefings throughout occupied Europe. The once safe 6 o'clock approach, traditionally considered the ideal angle for attacking B-17 formations, had become increasingly perilous. Tracer fire reached out earlier than expected, forcing pilots to react before they could establish stable firing positions. The psychological impact was immediate. Seeing streams of tracers at long range triggered instinctive evasive maneuvers, even when no bullets were hitting. In response, the Luftwaffe adapted their tactics in 3 stages. First, they increased their approach speeds, diving on the bomber formations at maximum velocity to minimize exposure. Second, they altered attack angles, coming from the high 6 o'clock position so gravity could assist their pull-out maneuvers. Third, the Luftwaffe attempted to single out bombers with the most aggressive gunners, aiming to eliminate threats before their tactics could influence the formation. Yet, none of these measures addressed the core issue. Higher speed attacks reduced accuracy, while steeper dive angles made tracking targets through the descent even more challenging. Identifying a skilled tail gunner in the chaos of a massive air battle proved nearly impossible. Between August 26th and September 5th, the 379th Bombardment Group conducted 11 missions. Aruth flew on 4 of these, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his record, while other tail gunners in his squadron accounted for an additional 7. The effectiveness of early engagement was becoming undeniable. The Luftwaffe's losses against the Triangle K bombers were steadily increasing. In response, German fighter commanders shifted tactics, concentrating their attacks on individual bomber groups rather than dispersing across the entire formation. Their goal was simple: overwhelm the defensive firepower through sheer numbers. The strategy achieved devastating results on September 3rd, when 8 bombers from the 100th Bombardment Group were destroyed in just 15 minutes. The 379th, however, avoided similar losses by taking a different position within the combat box. The outcome was clear: Aruth's aggressive tactics were forcing the enemy to rethink their approach. The Luftwaffe was adapting, constantly probing for weaknesses in the Americans' new defensive tactics. Over Europe, the air war had evolved into a high-stakes chess match, with each side analyzing the other's maneuvers and refining their strategies. Aruth understood the stakes clearly. His aggressive firing technique worked precisely because it caught the enemy off guard. Once the Germans developed effective counters, that advantage would vanish. Every mission became both a trial and a learning opportunity, each engagement a critical data point for both sides. By September 6th, the 379th would undertake its most daring mission yet, targeting Stuttgart deep in southern Germany, with the bombers flying more than 500 miles over enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence reports warned of heavy fighter presence, with German bases in France, Belgium, and Germany poised to intercept the bomber stream. Stuttgart was a hub for ball bearing production, critical to virtually every German vehicle, aircraft, and weapon, making it one of Europe's most fortified targets. Anti-aircraft batteries encircled the city, and fighter squadrons were deployed along every probable approach. On September 5th, the 379th Bombardment Group received its mission briefing. They would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, guiding navigation and bomb aiming for the formations behind. Being in the lead meant facing the first wave of enemy fighters, flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered, a position of maximum vulnerability to everything the Luftwaffe could unleash. That evening, Aruth meticulously inspected his guns. Both Browning M250s had been freshly serviced, the feed mechanism smooth, barrels replaced after countless rounds of combat. He loaded 1,200 rounds, well above the standard 800. The added weight was a concern, but in his mind, firepower outweighed everything else. Tomorrow would put his strategy to the ultimate test. His technique would either prove itself or fail in the deadliest mission of his career. At 5:40 on September 6th, the Stuttgart mission commenced. 187 bombers climbed into a gray, overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tandalo took the lead in the 379th formation, placing Aruth in the exact position where enemy fighters would strike first from any direction. By 9:15, the bomber formation reached French airspace. From airfields across the region, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbed, converging on the 379th's path. The first strikes came from the 11 o'clock position, head-on runs that challenged the nose gunners more than the tail. Aruth remained focused, tracking the contrails stretching behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was concentrating its forces, merging squadrons into a single, formidable attack group. By 9:40, intelligence reports estimated over 100 enemy fighters closing in on the bombers. The true danger for the tail gunners didn't arrive until 10:08, when the first wave struck from behind. 12 Bf-109s maneuvered 2,000 feet below the bomber formation before climbing in a coordinated attack from the low 6 o'clock position. Aruth reacted instantly, opening fire at 700 yards and sending tracers streaking into the lead fighter. 2 of the enemy planes broke off immediately, while a third took multiple hits, spiraling away in smoke. The remaining 9 pressed their assault relentlessly, cannon fire tearing through the 379th's combat box. The B-17 on Tandalo's left wing suffered hits to its number 3 engine, and another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Aruth switched targets rapidly, his eyes scanning the sky as fighters flashed past, while his ammunition count ticked down. 600, 500, 400 rounds remaining. The onslaught showed no sign of slowing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove toward Tandalo from high above and behind, using the sun to conceal its approach. Ruth spotted it too late. Heavy 20mm shells tore through the tail section before he could bring his guns to bear, slamming him against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed, the receiver shattered by the direct hit. Fragments tore through his flight suit, wounding his arms and scalp, and blood streamed across his face, partially blinding him. Despite the injuries, he continued firing with his right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up, rolling away, smoke trailing from damage caused during its dive. Ruth wiped blood from his eyes and scanned for the next attacker. Tandalo was badly damaged. The cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, crippled the tail controls, and punctured fuel tanks in the wings. The pilots struggled to keep Tandalo in the air, but the bomber was losing its battle against gravity and the damaged systems. By 11:04, the formation reached Stuttgart. Tandalo held course long enough to drop its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the crew struggled to compensate for the extensive damage. 2 engines were running unevenly, and fuel levels were critically low. Over eastern France, the pilots made a grim calculation. Tandalo could not make it back to England. Their only viable option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air rescue units might reach them before hypothermia set in. Aruth stayed at his post, scanning the skies for any pursuing fighters, but none appeared. The Luftwaffe had already moved on, targeting other, less damaged bombers still flying in formation. At 15:12, Tandalo struck the gray waters of the English Channel at 120 miles per hour, the fuselage breaking apart on impact. Aruth was thrown forward, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness consumed him. When he awoke, he was afloat in a life raft, the sound of British rescue boats approaching. Remarkably, all 10 crew members had survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions now rested on the seabed of the Channel. Back at base, the 379th Bombardment Group commander was already requesting Aruth's mission reports. On October 14, 1943, the Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived. The United States Army's second-highest military decoration honored Aruth for his extraordinary actions during the Castle and Stuttgart missions. The citation highlighted his choice to continue firing despite severe wounds, noting that his defensive fire had safeguarded the bomber during its most critical moments. By late October, the 8th Air Force Gunnery Staff had completed a detailed analysis covering 14 bomber groups over 3 months of operations. Their findings challenged long-standing assumptions that had shaped American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged enemy aircraft beyond 500 yards demonstrated significantly higher survival rates than those who adhered strictly to traditional doctrine. The tactic of engaging enemy aircraft at extended ranges proved its effectiveness by forcing German pilots onto the defensive, disrupting their attack formations before stable firing solutions could be established. While the approach demanded higher ammunition expenditure, the benefits outweighed the cost. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Air Force Bomber Command's operational planning, personally reviewed the data. The findings carried implications beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire across bomber formations could consistently disrupt massed fighter attacks, the established defensive doctrine required reconsideration. The formal revision of policy followed in November. New gunnery guidelines officially allowed tail gunners to engage enemy aircraft at extended ranges when tactical conditions warranted. While couched in cautious bureaucratic language, the directive validated the very approach that had kept Aruth alive. Unfortunately, he never witnessed the full implementation of the policy. The head injuries he sustained during the Stuttgart ditching were more severe than initially assessed. After returning to duty in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers permanently grounded him due to recurring headaches and vision problems. By the end of his combat career, Aruth had achieved 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables pending verification, placing him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some sources credited him with as many as 19 victories, though inconsistencies in record-keeping make exact totals uncertain. Following the Distinguished Service Cross, Aruth was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements, and the Purple Heart honored the wounds he had sustained. By the end of his combat career, he had earned more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the harsh winter of 1943, the invasion campaigns of 1944, and the final offensives of 1945. The tactics Aruth had pioneered gradually spread throughout the 8th Air Force, with tail gunners adopting variations of his early engagement doctrine. Over time, the statistical effect became apparent. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple operational factors contributed to the improvement. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced the bomber's exposure to unprotected combat zones, while improvements in aircraft systems further enhanced survivability. Defensive gunnery also played a significant role, and the adoption of aggressive early fire contributed to this improvement. German fighter pilots quickly noticed the shift. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe personnel highlighted the increased risk posed by tail gunners in American formations. What had once been straightforward attacks gradually became far more hazardous. Some pilots adapted by relying on high-speed head-on approaches, accepting the greater closure rates to avoid the deadly concentrated fire from the rear. Meanwhile, Aruth returned to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned Aruth to training duties, where he passed his hard-earned combat experience to new gunners preparing for deployment overseas. He spent the remainder of the war instructing others in the techniques that had ensured his survival. The students who completed his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, and across every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. He transferred to the newly established United States Air Force in 1947, continuing his service for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe retired in 1962 at the rank of Master Sergeant. Aruth's decision surprised many who knew his history. He had accumulated more combat experience than most could imagine, surviving multiple wounds, a ditching in the English Channel, and countless life-or-death encounters that official records could barely capture. Most veterans with similar experiences would have welcomed civilian life. Aruth saw things differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during some of the darkest years of the century. The skills he had honed had saved lives, not only his own, but those of the crews who flew alongside him and the gunners who adopted his methods. Walking away felt like abandoning something vital. His post-war years were quiet, but far from idle. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke of his combat experiences. His medals remained tucked away in a drawer, while the memories stayed locked in his mind. Like many of his generation, Aruth believed that those who had not lived it could never fully understand. Elmer Bendiner, Tanleo's navigator, chose a different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses, detailing the crew's experiences and preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. Bendiner's account ensured that Tanleo and her crew would not be forgotten. For decades after the war, the 379th Bombardment Group held reunions, giving veterans a chance to remember fallen comrades, share untold stories, and honor the young men they once were. Aruth attended reunions whenever his health allowed, reconnecting with survivors from those harrowing months over Europe. He passed away on February 15, 1990, in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. His remains were interred at the National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona on February 20th. The headstone recorded his rank, branch of service, and the war he fought, but it made no mention of the 17 enemy fighters he had destroyed, the crews he had shielded, or the air combat doctrine he had helped transform. Military cemeteries are full of such quiet understatement. Each stone marks a name and dates, but they can never convey the true weight of the lives behind them. Ruth rests among thousands of fellow veterans, each with stories that demand to be remembered. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the legacy of the bomber crews who flew from England. Among its archives are the mission reports of the 379th Bombardment Group, documenting Aruth's remarkable combat record. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through the documents, shaped by his actions. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists, and most of the aircraft that carried men like Aruth have been reduced to museum exhibits and memorials. Yet the principles he demonstrated, the effectiveness of aggressive action over passive defense, the courage to challenge fatal doctrine, remain as enduring lessons in military history. If this story moved you like it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every like helps bring these incredible stories to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale from history's hidden corners. We dig into forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories of tail gunners who protected their crews with courage, innovation, and sheer determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else? Our community stretches across the globe, and you're not just a viewer, you're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us your location. Share if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping make sure Michael Aruth and men like him are never forgotten.